Thank you. Ms. Bosler.
I would just follow up on what the LAO said. I think that the vast majority of the funds to support foster youth in our schools, which is absolutely critical for many of the reasons Dr. Weber talked about in terms of the instability that follows from being placed out of home, or even when you're placed with a family member, it may be across town, you're still having to change schools, and you may be moved around many times again. So we understand the importance, and that's why there's a special section in the LCAP where we are requiring districts to describe exactly what they are doing to serve this population. And so this is really a remnant of the old world where we had many different little categorical programs that served very specific purposes. And so this is one that was not folded into the LCFF. There were actually only a few categoricals that were not, and this one's one of them. And so our approach is to put the money to the LCFF and not to continue to grow these other categoricals, because really we want school districts to use their base resources to put important supports in place to support their students and make sure that they are successful.
Assemblyman.
I understand that completely, but if you have the category, isn't the message to districts, use the money from the category and use your LCFF money for other priorities, of which there are obviously a multitude? I mean, otherwise, why have the category in the first place?
Well, I think that's actually the big fear, is that, some school districts may say, well, that money is our money for foster youth, and so we're not going to spend any of our other base resources for foster youth. And that's absolutely not the message that we want to send school districts under this new rubric of accountability with the LCAP and with the LCFF. Those base resources are to serve all of their students, including students that may need extra supports. And so I think that is actually our concern. One of our concerns about growing this categorical outside is that some districts may look at it and say, well, that's the money I'm going to use to support foster youth, and then I'm going to free up these base resources for other things.
I appreciate that, but I return to my initial question then, which is why have the category in the first place? If it seems to me there's a conflicting message there.
Yeah. I mean, that was a discussion at the time when we did LCFF. There was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of concern about collapsing many of the categoricals that did end up getting collapsed. This one was one that people had really strong feelings at the time about keeping separate and continue to. That was a policy decision that was made that year.
Well, I would emphasize that we continue to.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Senator Lara.
Thank you. I just want to make a note that as we talk about the expansion of these services, that we want to make sure we don't, and I think it's not clear from the bill, I just want to make sure that it doesn't affect direct services, which we know are critical. So I just want to make a note of that if we move forward with this recommendation.
Thank you, Senator. Page 12 is after-school education and safety program. This is an Assembly proposal. Ms. Chu.
Yes, so the after-school education and safety program was established by Proposition 49 and provides $550 million annually to some school districts to provide before and after-school programs. School districts that receive this funding receive particular per-pupil rates for either the morning or afternoon program. Those rates are $5 for the morning and $7.50 for the afternoon program. Those rates have not been changed since the rates were established in 2006. The governor and the Senate did not have any proposals on this matter, but the Assembly did propose $50 million on an ongoing basis to adjust those per pupil rates to account for increases in the cost of living, including adjustments to the minimum wage. We would recommend going with the Senate's proposal, as not all school districts actually receive this funding. Only 353 school districts receive this funding, and to the extent that districts receiving ACES, as it's referred to, ACES funding, need additional funds to cover the cost of living, that is what their local control funding formula, additional supplemental and concentration funds can provide, since Typically, these grants for after-school programs are targeted to districts with high proportions of low-income and English learner and foster youth students.
Ms. Chu, how is it that only 353 districts are benefiting from these dollars?
So at the time when it was passed, it was in the proposition regarding how much money would be allocated to the program, and it only provided sufficient funding for a subset of districts to receive the funds. At the time of establishment, decile or low-performing schools at the time, decile 1 and 2 at the time, were eligible for the funding via a lottery. So effectively, the districts that currently receive the funding are just those who were chosen through the lottery process. Over time, some additional districts have been brought into the program due to some districts reducing their ACES programs for one reason or another, and so new money has gone out to additional districts, but that is the reason that it's a lower proportion of the total districts in the state.
And with this $50 million, do we know how much per student would be added? You said we're at $750 for the afternoon program now.
Correct. We estimate that the increase would be roughly $1 per student, depending on the current enrollments of after-school versus summer programs.
I know this is a very important issue to Senator Hancock in particular, who chairs our Public Safety Committee, and she frames it in terms of a missing piece in our care for young people, and of course, as you've mentioned, Ms. Chu, often from communities that lack resources and families that are unable to provide for attention and opportunities for these students in the afternoon. And she would point out, if she were here, that that's the time of day that these kids get into trouble with the law and get pregnant and complicate their lives, unfortunately and unnecessarily. So I know that this serves and will serve an important purpose. Can we measure the success of the Prop 49 program itself?
There have been a number of evaluations of the Proposition 49 after-school programs in terms of effects on student achievement, since the programs are required to include an educational component. I don't recall the results of those program evaluations at this moment, but I could get back to the committee on what those are.
If you could, please. I know, again, matter of priorities, limited funds, many demands, but if we do have the data that shows the effectiveness of the program itself, and I know that in the worst of times a few years ago, we were considering going back to the ballot to repeal the $550 million, which we didn't have at the time, as painful as it was going to be. That did not happen, so the money still is there. It hasn't been adjusted. When did it pass?
The proposition passed in 2002, but the funding didn't begin in 2006.
2006. So this would just update that and could potentially be a good investment in saving future expenses to the state down the road and certainly benefiting these children and their families at the same time. Ms. Bosler.
Yes, this is really in a very similar category to the item before. This one is a little different because the initiative process earmarked these monies. But again, the LCFF is very flexible money. Those monies can and should be invested in important after-school programs, but that's really up to the local school district to make that determination on what they need to serve their student body.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We don't really have a way to track which districts are doing what with regard to their LCFF, even from a metadata perspective. We don't know what percentage of our districts are using their dollars for these kinds of programs. For example, we don't know which percentage of them are using them for these foster care services. We're pretty much in the dark. So I agree. I agree with your point that we made the collective decision to move forward with LCFF to return the decision-making to the locals, and that we would pull back on our categorical mandates. But it's hard for us to make decisions when we really don't know what's going on there.
Well, we do have a lot of information and what the LCAPs are, and that gives an overall vision.
Do we
about-
aggregate that information?
No.
No,
We have-
no, because
we have
it's
the
really, I mean,
individual
it's
LCAPs.
really a very subjective document that school districts put together to really show their overall approach to how they're serving their students. And each one is unique and may have a different panoply of services.
I think one of the great challenges we consistently face, and it was a challenge that we faced when we approved LCFF, and don't want to beat a dead horse over and over, but in the approval of LCFF, we were initially agreed that there'd be levels of accountability with LCFF and some discussions of maintenance of service and what the issues ought to be that every school ought to address, and that some things were not optional, but they could address them in optional ways, in a variety of ways. And so, unfortunately, it has taken a long time, and we've not gotten to that point. So we are not, and that's where we have this situation. I mean, there's very little accountability. So if a school chooses not to do an after-school program, even though there may be a tremendous need in that community, there is no mechanism to force them to have an after-school program to create safety for their kids. In the same way, if we talk about staff development and training, there is no mandate for staff development and training. Even if the school is floundering and the teachers are not doing well or whatever, may need help, there's no mechanism for that either. So it's a really difficult thing. Everybody puts in their LCAP and those kinds of things. And one of the great challenges of local control, or what we used to say site decision-making when I was on the school board, is that without clear goals and objectives, without clear methods of accountability for what happens, you can get a wide range of things going on that may or may not be what you want and may not meet those issues, and all under the guise of local control. And so that's a real challenge, I think, and as we move forward with the state board or whatever, and because the governor has been somewhat resistant to bringing any change to the LCFF for years until it settles, which I can understand the need to not keep tinkering with it because you want the thing to work. But that's one of the real challenges, and so that's probably why we see these things coming forward if we don't have assurance that kids are going to get the services they need, whether it's foster care, whether it's after-school services. You get this wide range of discussion when you meet with school districts about what they do. That's why we're looking at career tech, because we thought everybody would jump in and use their appropriate resources to continue career tech. Some schools have, many schools have not. So we have this local control, and yet those of us at the state level believe there has to be some accountability, and so our constituents are asking, why aren't these programs exist? Because they assume we have some input into it, some control, and yet we've given it out, and so it's a real complicated matter, and it's obviously one we're going to see constantly coming up in the budget as we see the needs not being met, we think, effectively at the local level.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Page 13, Quality Education Investment Act, Transition Funding.
This was a proposal we had in our May revision. It's really just a one-time proposal in recognition that some districts who were being supported by the QEIA grants, and now I'm forgetting Quality Education Investment Act, transition funding. So that we're benefiting from those supports, which are going away. And then they also have moved into a basic aid status, so that, or actually they're not necessarily basic aid, but they're not necessarily, they don't have enough low-income English language learners or foster youth to get the additional concentration and supplemental grants. So this is just a one-time amount to transition some of those districts who were benefiting from QEIA that are no longer going to be benefiting from QEIA.
And Ms. Chu.
We recommend, so the Senate rejected this proposal from the governor, and the Assembly took the governor's proposal. We recommend taking the Senate. QEIA was established by legislation to provide roughly $3 billion over an 8-year period to some low-performing schools in the state, in part to address a lawsuit. funds were provided again on a lottery basis, and districts knew and schools knew that the funding would sunset in 2014-15. And we believe that maintaining funding for a subset of a subset, so the lottery was a subset, and then a smaller subset of these districts who don't qualify for concentration funding runs counter to the principles under LCFF of treating similar districts similarly.
Do we know how many districts fall into this category of, probably all of them, I guess, that don't have enough students to qualify for concentration grants?
Roughly a little less than half of districts do not qualify for concentration grants statewide.
And this one, this proposal, what, serves 10 schools, 10 districts?
Roughly 10 districts, yes.
Out of the 49% or so?
Yes, so there's roughly 1,000 school districts, so roughly less than 500, somewhere around 500 districts don't receive concentration funding, and this would continue funding for about 10 of those districts.
And they were informed that the money would go away this year?
Correct.
Okay.
That was part of the court settlement,
That's correct.
right? Is this also the issue that you're trying to address here? One of those situations, I know it is one-time money, but an attempt to address the fact that when we set a threshold, there will be some that don't quite meet it, and an argument can be made that's not fair. We could have set this threshold here, it was an arbitrary threshold, and now we're paying a penalty for it. Is that what you're trying to address?
I think this is in recognition that there are some districts who need additional time to plan for the ramp down of the resources that they are no longer receiving under the QEIA settlement.
Despite knowing going in that it was for 8 years?
Yes, so it is an exception.
Yes, Assemblyman Blow.
But there's a reason for the exception, and that's because these are the remaining districts that don't qualify for concentration grants in spite of the fact that they meet all of the other qualifications for some additional funding. To me, it's a little bit similar to the situation we face in the environmental side of the budget, where we're looking at distributing cap and trade money to disadvantaged communities. And there are some communities, notably some in the San Francisco Bay Area, that have all those qualities that we're looking for that make up a disadvantaged community, but they don't qualify under the environmental screen that's being used to determine where the funds go. So I think this is just an effort to create a level playing field for everybody for a little bit longer.
Right, and we need to readdress that screen, too. Senator Lara.
Understood.
I think the screen's perfectly fine, for the record. And also, I think this is, to support my assembly colleagues, I think this is an issue of fairness. These kids deserve these funds. And so I think as we move forward, I look forward to hopefully seeing a compromise that affect a small group of schools, and I think only 2 school districts. So I hope this conversation stays open, and we keep in mind that these schools have the students that we're trying to help and support. So I think it merits further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Ms. Bosler, how was the 4.583 figure arrived at?
Half of the 9.
Lisa Merzinski with Department of Finance. That represents about a half year of funding for these 10 school districts. So it just is kind of a step down towards. And many of them are getting close to reaching their LCFF target that will provide this funding for them. And it just allows them to maintain their resources, not cut the classroom sizes until their funding reaches that level.
Thank you. This will be continued. Page 14, Assessment Fellows and Consortia. Assembly proposal. Mr. Cabral.
Yes, so the governor and the Senate didn't have any proposal on this. The Assembly provided $7.3 million in one-time funding, one-time Prop 98 funding that could be used over 2 years. And there's really 2 components. One component is $1.2 million for 6 assessment fellows that would provide outreach, training, and support to LEAs. And the remaining $6 million would be provided through grants. That doesn't specify how many grants, but it would be a consortia of school districts or potentially county offices of education that would get together to disseminate some tools on standards implementation efforts. We recommend Senate on this. We think there is, districts are well underway in trying to implement these standards, and this budget will be providing significant increases in funding that can be used by school districts. What we do have, I think it is a bit tricky in that we have a very decentralized approach to implementing the standards. So districts have been receiving funding, county offices have been receiving funding, and they can choose how to develop tools for training and professional development. But we think they're well underway, and they have significant increases in LCFF and a significant amount of one-time funding that can be used in this budget. So because of that, we would recommend Senate.
Those would be Ms. Bosler's comments.
I'm going to go with ditto to the LEO. I will also note that we have the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, also just called the Collaborative here at the state level, that is really being designed and groomed to be a standards and best practices sharing forum at the state level, and that's really where we would want to put our emphasis. We understand that a portion of this is actually to backfill some positions at the County Office of Education that were previously supported by foundations. And while that they may be very good positions, I think our approach is that the local district or the local county office can choose to fund those with their base allocations.
We have some themes here.
Yeah. I think one of the things, though, we had mentioned, and our concern is that we are consistently asking the state board or the superintendent to have more oversight, more control, and more input into what is happening in our school districts. And we're not seeing it. And because there is no staff and support to do that at his level. And so that was one of our concerns as we looked at these individuals who would be fellows and researchers and people who can be utilized by the superintendent to actually manage this statewide school system. I mean, I know he has a lot of other staff that do all the other kind of stuff, but someone who actually works with schools in terms of school improvement. And I know the collaborative is supposed to do some of that. That's there, that will be under the guise of the state school board. And it hasn't really gotten up functioning yet and all that other good stuff that it's supposed to do. But this would be a group of individuals employed by the superintendent whose job would be to deal with some of these issues that we consistently say are not taking place. So we were concerned about that. The $1.2 million for fellows is over a 2-year period for them to, and one of the things I had requested in the process of doing this, of course, is to this one and maybe the next one as well, I'm not sure if, the next one as well, maybe, is that in addition to funding these positions for the 1 or 2 year period, that we have a report coming back to us as concerning its effectiveness, whether it's really helping the districts, a report from the districts whether or not this is really successful and helpful to them. I think it's page 19, it also has the same thing. So we looked at it and said, we're investing a lot of money and we're putting a lot of weight on this so-called local control funding formula agenda. And yet, at the same time, we're constantly talking about how we don't have any knowledge about what's going on, about whether or not schools are achieving their goals, what's the plan that's in place. We've got assessment documents that no one ever implements, whether it's a stalled bill or whatever else that exists out there. And so this would at least give us an opportunity to put the kind of people in place, hopefully to respond to work with the superintendent, and that we could that we could then come back and say, we've given you X amount of positions, what's the results? Because one of the things I wanted to put in was the fact that we would get a report back concerning the effectiveness of this model of having those fellows work with them and do the kinds of things that's necessary. So that's what we're looking at with this particular proposal. So we know it'll be held open, but I just wanted to understand it wasn't just the state superintendents requesting this assistance with regards to Common Core and other kinds of things that need to happen at the local level, and we talk about it, but it's not taking place right now, and it will require some expert staff to really accomplish it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Appreciate the background on that as well. We'll move on to local control and accountability plan transparency, another Assembly proposal. Ms. Chu.
Yes, so the Assembly passed some trailer bill language to direct the Department of Education to require districts to report 3 pieces of information that are components of the LCAP, but might not be explicitly laid out in every district's LCAP. Those 3 pieces of data would be the amount of funding districts receive for low-income English learner and foster youth students, the amount the district spent in the prior year on services for those students, and then the percent by which those districts were required to increase or improve services for those students. One of the conditions of the local control funding formula is that districts must increase or improve services for low-income English learner and foster youth students in proportion to the increase in the funds that they receive. A number of members have expressed concern that the state has inadequate information about how districts are using their local control funding formula, supplemental and concentration funding, particularly how they're using it to increase and improve services for these students. We'd recommend adopting the Assembly trailer bill language as it attempts to address this issue. However, we'd recommend a few modifications to the language to ensure that the data could really be used on a statewide basis and be comparable across districts. Specifically, we believe the language would need to clarify exactly what districts are supposed to report in terms of what bucket of funding are they supposed to report. Is it just their LCFF funds? Is it LCFF funds plus any local funds or federal funds? Are they supposed to identify new activities for these students or new and ongoing activities for these students? And lastly, how should districts report school-wide and district-wide expenditures on behalf of these students, particularly in districts that have very high concentrations when many of their efforts might be on a school-wide and district-wide basis? So we believe that the language certainly has merit, but it just needs a bit more refining in order for the data to be useful on a statewide basis. And this issue, I'll just say that does really go back to the issue that the committee was talking about previously in terms of what information does the state have about what districts are doing for the local, on the local control funding formula.
So with regard to this whole issue of transparency and accountability, what is the requirement currently of the Department of Education in getting this information out?
So currently the Department of Education has to provide links to all districts' local control and accountability plans, in which districts must provide how much money they received in supplemental and concentration funding, and they must also report the percentage by which they are increasing or improving services. So 2 of the data elements required in this trailer bill are already things that are in districts' LCAPs, but they're not being aggregated into any statewide database. We have them for individual districts across the state, but no compilation of that data.
Senator Lara.
Thank you. You know, I do think this is an important thing to do, and I appreciate the LAO's recommendation. My only concern is, does the LAO have an opinion if it should come from the general fund or it should come from Prop 98?
So
Oh, I'm sorry.
there's no funding associated with this.
Sorry, I'm ahead of you. Sorry. This is me trying to multitask, and of course, I'm doing a horrible job at it.
Only women do that.
Yes, Vice Chairwoman, only women multitask.
Successful.
Ms. Bosler.
Yes, so we haven't read all of the fine points of the language, and we're absolutely always open to continuing to refine the rubric of accountability, which is new, and we're going through a lot of learning processes. There's a lot going on at the State Board of Ed. A lot of testimony has been taken, bringing in the inputs from all different parts of the field. Who are having to live and breathe this new system of accountability, the LCAP. And so, I think this language, what we know about it right now, I think is not necessary. Those data elements are already included in the LCAP, and we would be very reluctant about building large new data systems at the state level. it's just not, it's a different, we've moved into a different rubric of oversight and evaluation that's not as data intensive and as much more, understanding that all districts are different, but we do require them to report on how they are serving the low-income English learner and foster youth students and how they are providing more funding to support those individuals in their success at school.
Ms. Chu, is it accurate to suggest that, and I know you did say you supported the trailer bill language with some modifications, but that maybe this suggestion, notwithstanding Ms. Bosler's recent comments, is just a little premature, that we might give the LCFF another year or two to see if, in fact, we are gathering this information sufficiently and don't really need this additional?
Well, I think 2 points. It's our understanding that the Department of Education could collect this data rather easily. It just requires some modification to existing reporting mechanisms that districts provide information to the state within. But more directly to your question, one of the issues that we brought up in our report that we issued in January when we looked at a sample of local control and accountability plans was that it was, in some cases, difficult to tease out these pieces of data, and that we do not have any collection of that data on a statewide basis. And so to the extent that the legislature would like to have access to the data on a statewide basis, this would be a mechanism for achieving that end. Right now, the only way to get at that data is to read every LCAP from every district and charter school.
So that was really my question earlier about, do we aggregate? And we're not.
We do not aggregate any of the data.
Yeah.
Correct.